Hi, how are you? I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com, and presently we're going to take a brief tour of modal logic and counterfactuals. Take the two popular examples: if Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, then someone else did. That's example A. And then we have, if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, then someone else would have, and that is example B. An indicative conditional, if P is the case, then Q is the case, deals with changes in belief. The first proposition is obviously true. Why? Because we already know that Kennedy was indeed assassinated. Ergo, if Oswald wasn't the person to kill Kennedy, obviously someone else must have done that. Logically, the antecedent P implies that I should believe the consequent Q. So formally, we have something very familiar. Again, if P is the case, then Q is the case. In contrast, a so-called subjunctive conditional deals with alternatives. It deals with how the antecedent affects history, not about my beliefs or your beliefs as such. If P were the case, then Q would be the case. It's a counterfactual. Again, the famous example is, if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, then someone else would have. This is not obviously true. In fact, at least if the Warren Commission is right that Oswald worked alone, it is doubtful. Maybe if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, nobody would have. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case or that the Warren Commission was right. We're just trying to consider the logic here. For instance, notice that an indicative conditional can be true while being false if stated as a subjunctive conditional. When thinking about the subjunctive conditional, we take away the causal connection between the antecedent and the consequent. Without Oswald, there is no causal connection to assassination. Now, David Lewis famously dealt with this issue with subjunctives with possible worlds. We have the actual world we all reside in. We then can make small modifications to change it into a different possible world. With very few changes, we have a close possible world. With many, many changes, we have a far away possible world. The question is, can this conceptual apparatus help us? It's actually a very challenging question. Now, the book I am thinking about as a reference is A Survey of Metaphysics by E.J. Lowell. And he puts one formulation this way in his textbook. If it had been the case that P, then it would have been the case that Q is true, if and only if Q is true in the closest possible world in which P is true. On first glance, that seems totally reasonable. There are infinitely many different possible worlds, and we're thinking about the one that's closest to ours in order to answer the counterfactual question. However, what does it even mean to be a close possible world? How do we know if it is, so to speak, close enough? Is there such a thing in fact, even in a theoretical sense? And all of this is quite controversial. Can we really find a possible world that really is closest versus just close enough? So something more reasonable, perhaps, is this modification. If it had been the case that P, then it would have been the case that Q is true if and only if Q is true in all of the closest possible worlds in which P is true. At the very least, this modification appears more reasonable. There may be two or more possible worlds that are equally close to our own. So we need it to be the case that in all those worlds, when P is true, Q is true. Now, there's a lot of underlying logic implicit here, and many challenges and questions, and we're just going to sample this. Take the conditional excluded middle. Now, one of the symbols here, when we're dealing with our counterfactual, when we're dealing with our subjunctive conditional, we're going to say P box. So if P were the case, then Q would be the case. So they would be, we're using that box. And the conditional excluded middle says that essentially, insofar as the conditional were to hold, then either the consequent Q would be true or false, one or the other. But this in fact fails with our modification 2. That's because insofar as Q is true only in some, not all, of the closest possible worlds where P is true, this implies that A, if it had been the case at P, then it would have been the case at Q, and B, if it had been the case at P, then it would have been the case that non-Q are both false. But according to the conditional excluded middle principle, if one of those is false, the other one must be true. So it violates our CEM. And this also implies that if we think about P box Q, that's not logically equivalent to not parentheses P box arrow not Q. And logicians and philosophers have also thought about a might conditional. So with the might conditional, we're using the diamond. And here we do have a logical equivalency between the might conditional and this would be conditional. That is, if it had been the case that P, then it might be the case that Q. That's logically equivalent to, it is not the case that if it had been the case that P, then it would have been the case that non-Q. The example that E.J. Lowell gives is, if I had tossed this coin, that it might have landed on heads. That's logically equivalent to, it is not the case that if I had tossed this coin, that it would have not landed heads. Now, philosophers and logicians have explored this a lot, and they still debate a lot of this stuff. So the issue of would counterfactuals are not transitive, or contrapositive, or subject to strengthening, and these types of issues are explored in a survey of metaphysics. So if you're interested, I encourage you to purchase that book or others like it. And I think one of the things that makes modal logic so interesting is that it is really impossible to brush off questions of metaphysics. You cannot escape thinking about metaphysics if you're doing modal logic well, or if you're trying to understand the issues of modal logic. Traditionally, in fact, it's been understood that there's a certain sense that metaphysics is prior to logic. There are deep underlying metaphysical principles. Different logics, plural, try to formally capture different abstract forms of argumentation. But those models cannot be viewed as answering deeper metaphysical questions at the end of the day. Now, I encourage all of you who are interested to study these issues further. There's a lot to learn. There's certainly a lot for me to learn. But in any case, I hope this video is helpful to you and gives you something to think about. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. I would appreciate that. And if you haven't already, visit my website at amateurlogician.com. Thanks for watching. Good luck to you and be well.